11,000 feet above central Germany, a single P-51 Mustang held position between 30 twin-engine fighters and a bomber stream of 130 aircraft. The fuel gauge showed less than 40 minutes of combat reserve. The ammunition counters for 4 of 6 guns had already dropped to 0. And somewhere ahead, the radio chatter of Luftwaffe pilots carried a frequency of confusion that American intelligence officers would later describe as unprecedented. One fighter, one pilot, and the mathematical certainty that what he was attempting could not succeed. The air over Oschersleben carried a particular quality that January morning, cold enough to freeze oil lines if throttle management slipped, thin enough that any sustained climb would push the Merlin engine toward its operational ceiling. At 27,000 feet, the B-17 flying fortresses of the 1st Bombardment Division held their combat boxes with the rigid geometry that doctrine demanded, each aircraft maintaining its position within a formation designed to maximize overlapping fields of defensive fire. The temperature outside the cockpit glass registered somewhere below -40 degrees. At this altitude, the difference between Fahrenheit and Celsius ceased to matter. Both scales converged toward the same brutal number. Major James Howard scanned the horizon from his position above the lead bomber group, his P-51B holding station in the Escort pattern that the 354th Fighter Group had rehearsed across dozens of missions. The Mustang's Packard-built Merlin engine ran smooth at cruise power, the manifold pressure gauge steady, the oil temperature sitting in the acceptable range despite the altitude. Behind him, the fighters of his squadron maintained their own positions, 16 aircraft spread across the defensive umbrella that doctrine prescribed for deep penetration escort. The mission had proceeded according to plan for the first 2 hours. Landfall over the Dutch coast, the long transit across the Reich's outer defenses, the gradual climb to bombing altitude as the formation approached the target area. Then the fuel calculations began to assert their authority. The P-51 had transformed the escort problem in ways that previous fighters could not. Its laminar flow wing and efficient Merlin engine gave it range figures that seemed impossible to pilots trained on P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings. But even the Mustang had limits. A deep penetration to Oschersleben, one of the most heavily defended targets in Germany, pushed those limits to their edge. At the briefing that morning, the fuel equations had been clear. External drop tanks would carry the escort to the target area. Internal fuel would sustain combat operations during the bomb run. Return fuel demanded that engagement time remain limited, that ammunition expenditure stay disciplined, that the escort groups hand off responsibility to fresh units at designated waypoints. The handoff never came. The relief escort, scheduled to arrive from a different fighter group, failed to materialize over the target. Whether weather, mechanical problems, navigation errors, or enemy interception had disrupted their arrival remained unknown to Howard in that moment. What he knew was simpler. The bombers were approaching the most dangerous segment of their mission, and the defending fighters were running low on fuel. One by one, the P-51s of his formation began to turn west. The decision to break escort was not cowardice. It was arithmetic. A fighter with insufficient fuel to reach friendly territory served no purpose to the men it was trying to protect. Doctrine demanded that escort pilots conserve enough reserve to reach England to fight another day, to avoid adding their own aircraft to the loss columns that 8th Air Force headquarters tracked with grim precision. Howard watched his wingman's aircraft bank toward the distant coast. Then the second element leader, then the third. The fuel state that forced their departure was the same fuel state his own gauges displayed. The same mathematics applied to his cockpit with identical force. He held position. The decision did not announce itself with conscious deliberation. The major simply continued his patrol pattern above the bomber stream, his eyes tracking the horizon where the first specks of approaching interceptors had begun to materialize. They came from the east, climbing hard to reach the altitude of the bomber formation. The Luftwaffe had developed its own doctrine for intercepting American heavy bombers, doctrine built around the twin realities of firepower and closing speed. The German fighters would position themselves ahead of the formation, then execute slashing attacks from the nose, where the B-17's defensive armament was weakest, and the closure rates gave gunners minimal tracking time. Howard counted the approaching shapes. The number exceeded 20. His own formation had dissolved to nothing. Below him, 130 bombers pressed toward their target with no fighter cover remaining. Above him, the sky held nothing but a single P-51 and the vast emptiness of high altitude. The engagement geometry that was about to unfold defied every principle of fighter combat. A single aircraft against a coordinated interceptor force represented not merely difficult odds, but tactical impossibility. Fighter doctrine across all air forces rested on the principle of mutual support, of wingmen covering blind spots, of numerical concentration against isolated targets. What Howard was about to attempt violated these principles with a directness that bordered on reckless. The Luftwaffe pilots completing their climb toward the bomber stream expected to find the usual conditions of a successful intercept: dispersed or absent escort, multiple attack runs available, the mathematical comfort of overwhelming numbers against defensive fire that grew less accurate as combat stretched on. They did not expect what Howard intended to give them. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. The man in that cockpit had arrived at this moment through a path that few American pilots could claim. Born in China to missionary parents, raised across cultures, educated in American institutions, James Howell Howard carried the quiet confidence of someone who had already tested himself against impossible odds before the Army Air Forces ever assigned him to a fighter squadron. His route to the European theater had wound through the Pacific first. In the months after Pearl Harbor, Howard had flown with the American Volunteer Group in China, the collection of pilots who would become known as the Flying Tigers. That organization operated under conditions that no subsequent American air unit would face: isolated from supply lines, outnumbered by experienced opponents, dependent on aircraft that other commands had discarded as obsolete. The tactics he learned there bore little resemblance to the doctrine taught at American training bases. Chennault's methods emphasized the calculated avoidance of fair fights, the exploitation of specific aircraft advantages, the discipline to break off engagements before they devolved into turning contests that favored more maneuverable opponents. Howard had internalized these lessons across dozens of missions over Burma and China. He understood, in ways that pilots trained exclusively in the European theater did not, how a single aircraft might survive against multiple opponents through positioning, energy management, and the refusal to commit to exchanges that statistics said he must lose. The Flying Tigers had claimed 6 confirmed aerial victories for Howard before the group disbanded and its pilots filtered back into conventional military structures. He transferred to the Army Air Forces, accepted a commission, and found himself assigned to the new P-51 groups being organized for escort duty in England. His temperament suited the new role. Other pilots who had flown with the AVG described Howard as quiet, methodical, unlikely to volunteer information about his record in China unless directly questioned. He did not cultivate the public persona that some aces developed. His preparation for missions was thorough without being theatrical. His flying was precise without being flashy. The 354th Fighter Group received him as an experienced hand at a time when experienced hands remained scarce. The transition from P-40 Warhawks to P-51 Mustangs required adaptation, but the fundamental skills transferred: energy management, situational awareness, the patience to wait for favorable setups rather than forcing engagements on unfavorable terms. By January 1944, he had risen to squadron commander and then to deputy group commander, his authority built on competence rather than rank alone. The younger pilots learned quickly that Howard's suggestions carried the weight of tested experience, that his assessments of tactical situations reflected realities they had not yet encountered themselves. What they could not know, watching him climb into his aircraft that morning, was how the lessons of China would reassert themselves over Germany. The Flying Tigers had survived by thinking like hunters rather than warriors, by treating each engagement as a problem to be solved rather than a contest to be won through direct confrontation. The problem Howard now faced admitted no conventional solution, but the habits of mind that Burma and Kunming had instilled did not require conventional solutions. They required only the willingness to attempt what doctrine said could not be done. The missions preceding January 11, 1944, had established patterns that Howard relied upon with quiet consistency. Each escort sortie presented its own variations, but certain principles held across all of them. Fuel discipline defined everything. The P-51's range advantage over previous escort fighters was significant but not unlimited. Every minute spent in combat above enemy territory subtracted from the return margin. Every unnecessary maneuver, every full-throttle pursuit, every extended engagement depleted reserves that might prove essential later. Howard managed his fuel state with the precision of an accountant. He knew the consumption rates at various power settings, the way altitude affected efficiency. The critical thresholds below which return to England became uncertain and then impossible. This awareness shaped every tactical decision, keeping his attacks brief, his pursuits measured, his position always oriented toward the ultimate requirement of reaching home. The Luftwaffe interceptors he had faced on previous missions operated under their own constraints. German fighter production could not match American losses indefinitely. Experienced pilots were dying faster than training programs could replace them. The defenders had to economize their efforts, concentrating on the bombers rather than the escort whenever possible, accepting that some attacks would be disrupted in order to press others home. Howard had learned to read the patterns of their approaches, the high-altitude setups for frontal passes, the climb profiles from airfields along the route, the way formations would split to attack multiple bomber groups simultaneously, accepting reduced concentration in exchange for wider disruption. His responses to these patterns followed methods refined across months of combat. Position above the threat axis. Descend only when interception was certain. Make the first pass count, because second chances rarely came. Break off before the engagement. Drew him too far from the bombers he was protecting. This last principle mattered most. The natural instinct of a fighter pilot was pursuit, the drive to convert an advantage into a kill, to follow a damaged opponent until destruction was confirmed. Howard suppressed this instinct with deliberate force. His job was not to accumulate victories. His job was to keep German fighters away from American bombers. Every second spent chasing a single opponent was a second during which other attackers pressed their runs unopposed. The distinction seemed subtle, but proved decisive in practice. Pilots who chased too long returned to find their charges scattered, their formation brothers shot down, their mission failed despite personal success. Pilots who broke off early, who returned immediately to station, who accepted disruption without confirmation, these pilots kept their bomber groups intact. Howard's record reflected this discipline. His confirmed victories had accumulated steadily but not spectacularly. More important were the missions where his interventions had turned back attacks without claims, where his presence above the formation had deterred approaches that never materialized into engagements. The crews of the bombers he escorted rarely knew his name. What they knew was that certain missions returned with light losses, that certain escorts seemed more effective than others at keeping the interceptors at bay. The connection between those outcomes and the quiet major holding station above them remained invisible, but it was real. By January 1944, Howard had developed what experienced pilots called a feel for the air, an ability to sense the flow of an engagement before it fully developed, to position himself where threats would materialize rather than where they had already appeared. This skill could not be taught in any classroom. It emerged only from accumulated hours, accumulated contacts, accumulated decisions made at combat speed and then analyzed in the quiet afterward. The mission to Oschersleben would demand everything this experience had built, and it would demand something more, something that no previous mission had required, because no previous mission had stripped away every margin, every reserve, every option except the one that doctrine said did not exist. The relief escort's failure to arrive created a cascade of consequences that no mission planning could have anticipated. The fuel reserves that had been calculated to support handoff now had to support solo operations. The ammunition that had been budgeted for coordinated attack now had to suffice for individual defense. The tactical assumptions underlying every briefed contingency collapsed into a single, stark reality. The bombers had no protection except one pilot who was already beyond his return margin. Howard's fuel state at this moment hovered near the threshold that demanded immediate withdrawal. His gauges showed quantities that training and doctrine agreed were insufficient for continued combat operations plus safe return to England. The mathematics were unambiguous. Staying meant accepting that normal return might become impossible. He did not calculate the exact percentages. The numbers mattered less than the immediate tactical situation. The Luftwaffe interceptors were completing their setup for the initial attack run. In minutes, they would begin their passes against the bomber formation. If no escort opposed them, those passes would continue until fuel or ammunition forced the German pilots to break off. Multiple runs, multiple opportunities, multiple bombers falling. The B-17 crews below had no knowledge of their escort situation. Their attention focused forward, on the target, on the anti-aircraft defenses ahead, on the bomb release points that bombardiers were computing with cold precision. They trusted that the distant specks above them represented protection, that the escort plan was functioning as briefed. Howard's position gave him visibility that the bomber crews lacked. He could see the interceptor formation climbing toward attack altitude. He could count the aircraft, estimate their type, predict their approach geometry. What he could see made clear that the next few minutes would determine whether this raid succeeded or catastrophically failed. The decision point arrived without announcement. One moment, continued escort remained possible. The next, the fuel state crossed below the threshold that doctrine defined as minimum for withdrawal. Once crossed, that threshold could not be recrossed. The fuel was spent. The option was gone. Howard stayed. The P-51 held its altitude above the bomber stream, its pilot tracking the approaching interceptors with the focused attention that combat demanded. The escort pattern that doctrine prescribed for multiple aircraft simplified when only one aircraft remained. There was only one position to hold, only one set of eyes scanning, only one fighter to interpose between the attackers and their targets. What Howard intended was not a defensive orbit. Passive positioning would allow the German pilots to time their attacks, to approach during the moments when his aircraft pointed away, to slip through the gaps that even the most vigilant single pilot could not close. Defense required offense. The only way to stop 30 fighters with one was to attack, to present them with a threat they could not ignore, to force them into reactions that disrupted their coordination. The first of the interceptors was reaching attack altitude now. The twin-engine shapes resolved into identifiable silhouettes as closing distance made their configurations clear. Heavy fighters, the type the Luftwaffe had developed specifically for bomber interception, aircraft carrying firepower sufficient to destroy a B-17 with a single accurate pass. Howard pushed his throttle forward and pointed his nose toward the lead element. The physics of what followed demanded more from aircraft and pilot than any training scenario had prepared. A P-51 diving from altitude advantage accumulated energy that could be converted into multiple attack passes if managed correctly. The Mustang's airframe would accept dive speeds that other fighters could not match, its laminar flow wing remaining controllable at velocities that induced compressibility problems in less refined designs. But this energy came with conditions. Expend it poorly, and the fighter ended up slow, low, and vulnerable. Expend it well, and survival remained possible even against overwhelming numbers. Howard's opening dive took him through the climbing German formation at an angle that gave minimal deflection time for their gunners. The closure rate exceeded 500 miles per hour, a velocity at which human reaction time became insufficient for accurate tracking. The Mustang's .650 caliber machine guns fired in a burst, measured in fractions of seconds, the rounds tracing toward the lead interceptor before Howard pulled through and converted his remaining speed into a climbing turn. Whether his fire struck the target remained uncertain in the moment. At these speeds, at these distances, pilots rarely observed results directly. What he observed instead was the reaction of the formation behind him, the coordinated approach disrupted, elements breaking to avoid the descending fighter, the timing of their attack thrown off by seconds that might translate into miles of bomber formation movement. This was the method, not destruction but disruption, not kills but interference. The fundamental mathematics of interception required setup time, approach angles, careful positioning. Each intervention reset those calculations. Each pass through the German formation forced them to begin again. Howard's climb carried him back above the bomber stream, his altitude advantage restored through the energy he had accumulated in the dive. The Merlin engine held its power settings without protest, the manifold pressure gauge showing the strain of high-altitude combat but remaining within acceptable limits. The fuel gauge had dropped further. The ammunition counters for 2 of his guns showed empty. The German interceptors reorganized below and behind. Their formation integrity had suffered from his initial pass, but 30 aircraft could absorb disruption and continue. New elements were positioning for approach runs from different vectors, spreading their attacks to complicate the lone defender's task. Howard read their movements through the canopy glass, his eyes tracking the shapes against the winter sky, while his hands adjusted throttle and stick to maintain position. The bomber stream continued its steady progress toward Oschersleben, the B-17s holding formation with the mechanical precision that training had instilled. Their gunners watched the distant fighters with the helpless attention of men who could observe but not intervene. The second wave of attacks developed from the 7 o'clock position, a shallow diving approach that would bring the German fighters through the rear of the bomber formation. This vector exposed them to tail gunner fire, but gave the attackers tracking time against relatively stable targets, standard doctrine for situations where frontal passes had been disrupted. Howard turned into their approach and pushed the nose down. The G-forces built as he tightened his turn, the airframe creaking with the stress of combat maneuvering at speeds that tested its design limits. his flight suit squeezed against his legs and abdomen, the anti-G protection that kept blood from pooling in his lower body during high-load turns. The edges of his vision compressed slightly, the familiar warning of approaching blackout that every fighter pilot learned to recognize. He eased the pull just enough to maintain consciousness, the aircraft arcing toward the approaching German element at an angle that would intersect their path before they reached the bombers. The timing was precise by necessity. Too early, and they would adjust their approach. Too late, and their attack would complete before he could intervene. The interception point arrived at the exact moment his gun sight aligned with the lead German fighter. 4 guns fired, the 2 empty weapons silent in the harmonized ripple that doctrine demanded. The rounds walked toward the target, and Howard pulled through the formation before observing results, his attention already shifting to the next threat developing from a different quarter. Behind him, the German attack broke off. Whether from damage inflicted, from the disruption of his pass, or from the simple calculation that continued approach against active opposition reduced their own survival odds, the second wave scattered rather than pressing through to the bombers. Time ceased to behave normally. The engagement expanded into a sequence of individual moments that Howard experienced with unusual clarity, while the larger duration compressed beyond conscious measurement. Minutes passed, perhaps many minutes. The fuel gauge descended. The ammunition counters dropped toward empty. The German attacks continued, wave after wave, element after element, the persistent pressure of opponents who recognized that one fighter could not sustain indefinite defense. And yet that one fighter continued. The Luftwaffe pilots confronting Howard faced a problem their training had not anticipated. Their standard tactics assumed that escort fighters, if present, would engage in defensive patterns that could be outmaneuvered through numerical concentration. They assumed that persistent attack would eventually exhaust defender ammunition, defender fuel, defender physical stamina. They assumed that one aircraft defending 130 bombers represented a condition so temporary that waiting it out cost little. What they encountered instead was a pilot who refused to accept these assumptions. Each time they positioned for attack, the single P-51 appeared in their path. Each time they adjusted their approach, the adjustment was anticipated and countered. Each time they attempted to slip past during the moments when the defender was engaged elsewhere, the defender seemed to predict their movement and arrive before they could complete their run. The interceptions accumulated. Howard dove through the German formation repeatedly, his passes disrupting coordination, his fire forcing evasive maneuvers, his mere presence creating uncertainty about attack timing that tactical doctrine could not resolve. The individual engagements blurred together, each pass demanding the same sequence of decisions, the same physical exertion, the same extraction before energy depletion made him vulnerable. His ammunition situation deteriorated toward critical. The counters that had started with full loads now showed figures that demanded conservation. Each burst had to count. Each firing opportunity had to be evaluated against the remaining rounds. The mathematics that governed fuel now governed weapons as well, the constraints multiplying rather than easing. Yet the German attacks were not succeeding. The bomber formation continued toward its target with losses far below what the concentration of defenders should have inflicted. Something about the aerial battle was producing outcomes that individual engagement results could not explain. It was the effect of continuous interference rather than decisive destruction. Howard's passes were not achieving complete kills on every run, but they were achieving something more valuable. They were preventing the German fighters from achieving their kills on the bombers. The disruption, repeated dozens of times, accumulated into mission-level consequences that single aircraft tactics were not supposed to produce. The bomber crews, watching from their positions, could not understand what they were witnessing. They saw a single Mustang appearing and reappearing at the edges of their formation, engaging threats that approached from every direction, somehow present wherever danger materialized. The impossibility of this coverage suggested multiple aircraft, a coordinated defense that seemed more substantial than one pilot could provide. But there was only one pilot, and his fuel gauge now showed quantities that could no longer support extended combat. The engagement's conclusion did not arrive as a dramatic climax, but as an accumulation of small consequences that shifted the balance beyond recovery. The German interceptors had expended their own resources. Their fuel states, like Howard's, had limits. Their ammunition supplies had been depleted by the repeated attack setups that failed to produce results. Their formation coordination had degraded through the sustained interference. Individual pilots, losing contact with their element leaders, approach timing drifting beyond the precision that effective attack required. One by one, the German fighters began to turn east. The mathematical logic that had driven Howard's squadron mates to withdraw now applied to the opponents as well. Continued engagement promised diminishing returns against increasing risk. The bomber formation remained intact. The target attack would proceed despite their efforts. Howard watched the withdrawal from his position above the bombers, his exhausted attention tracking each departing shape until the sky held only the bomber stream and his single aircraft. The battle had lasted approximately 30 minutes. In that duration, he had made individual attacks against enemy aircraft, numbering in excess of 30, his repeated passes through the German formation producing effects that could not be precisely quantified but were visible in the intact bombers below. The aftermath demanded decisions that combat had temporarily suspended. His fuel state was now genuinely critical. The return to England would stretch the remaining reserves beyond comfortable margins. His ammunition was functionally exhausted, 4 of 6 guns empty, the remaining 2 holding rounds measured in small numbers rather than the hundreds that full belts provided. His aircraft had suffered damage that the sustained combat made inevitable. The P-51 skin showed holes that had not been there at takeoff. The engine continued to run, but the strain of high altitude, combat maneuvering might have produced internal consequences not yet visible on the gauges. The flight controls responded, but their precision had degraded slightly from the repetitive high G loading that the engagement demanded. Howard turned his aircraft west and began the long transit toward the English coast. The bomber formation behind him continued to Oschersleben, delivered their ordnance on the aircraft factory that was the mission target, and turned for their own return journey. The losses they sustained that day were significantly lighter than intelligence had predicted for a target so heavily defended. The escort that had protected them through the most dangerous phase remained a subject of confusion among the crews, some believing they had been covered by multiple fighter groups, others uncertain what they had witnessed. The return flight tested every remaining capacity. Howard managed his fuel with the precision that survival demanded, adjusting power settings to extract maximum range from minimum reserves. The engine held. The airframe held. The weather cooperated sufficiently to permit navigation despite the exhaustion that made concentration difficult. He landed in England with fuel quantities that would later be described as residual, the tanks containing perhaps enough for one additional circuit of the airfield and nothing more. The aircraft was immediately impounded for damage assessment, the maintenance crews discovering impacts and stresses that revealed the intensity of combat Howard had sustained. Debriefing produced information that the initial combat reports had not captured. Howard's account of his solo defense was met with skepticism that gave way to astonishment as the tactical picture assembled from multiple sources. Bomber crews from different positions in the formation corroborated the presence of a lone P-51 engaging repeated waves of attackers. Gun camera footage from Howard's aircraft, where the cameras had continued to function, provided visual evidence of the engagement density. The intelligence officers attempting to reconstruct the battle found themselves unable to reconcile the observed outcomes with the known inputs. One fighter, 30 minutes. 30 or more opponents engaged. Bomber formation intact. The mathematics suggested impossibility. The evidence suggested it had happened anyway. In the following days, the reports moved up the chain of command. Each level of review added its own layer of documentation, its own assessment of what the evidence revealed. By the time the reports reached the highest echelons of 8th Air Force, the question had shifted from whether Howard's actions were unusual to whether they were unprecedented. The Medal of Honor recommendation that resulted moved through channels with unusual speed. The official citation, when it was finally approved and released, employed language that reflected the constraints of military documentation rather than the realities of aerial combat. It spoke of gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. It referenced the destruction and damage of enemy aircraft in numbers that formal confirmation protocols supported. It described the defense of bomber formations in terms that emphasized courage without capturing the mechanical exhaustion of sustained combat maneuvering. The ceremony that presented the medal occurred months later, the formalities surrounding the award following their own timeline independent of the events they commemorated. Howard received the recognition with the same quiet demeanor that had characterized his entire service, the public attention neither sought nor welcomed. What the citation could not convey was the experience of those 30 minutes from the inside, the accumulating fatigue in arms that had worked the controls through dozens of high-G maneuvers, the narrowing of attention as combat stretched beyond the duration that training scenarios ever simulated, the fuel gauge descending past thresholds that doctrine defined as critical, then beyond, into ranges that represented genuine uncertainty about return. The citation spoke of enemy aircraft destroyed. The reality was more complex. Howard's confirmed kills from that engagement numbered fewer than the total aircraft he had engaged, the chaos of sustained combat making precise damage assessment impossible. But his mission objective had never been personal score. His objective had been the preservation of 130 bombers and their crews, and that objective he had achieved through methods that defied individual measurement. The bomber crews who survived because of his defense mostly never knew his name. The war continued. New missions replaced old ones in memory. The specific details of January 11, 1944, blurred into the larger pattern of the air campaign that would continue for another 16 months. Howard himself did not cease flying after the medal. He continued to command, to lead missions, to accumulate the hours that transformed experience into habit. The war's end found him alive, one of the minority of fighter pilots who survived the entire European campaign. His subsequent career moved through the standard progressions of military service, rising eventually to brigadier general before retirement. The later years brought neither fame nor obscurity. Howard lived quietly, spoke rarely about his service, declined most requests for interviews or commemorations. When asked about the mission over Oschersleben, his responses were brief, technically precise, and notably lacking in the drama that interviewers expected. He did not describe what he had done as heroism. The word seemed foreign to his understanding of the events. He had been present. Bombers needed protection. The other, escorts, were gone. The decision to stay had not felt like a decision at all, but simply the continuation of the job he had been assigned to do. This was perhaps the most difficult aspect for observers to comprehend. The Medal of Honor framework assumed that extraordinary actions required extraordinary motivations, that the risks accepted indicated calculations made and consequences weighed. Howard's experience suggested something different. The risks had been obvious. The calculation had been minimal. He had simply done what seemed necessary because no one else remained to do it. The Luftwaffe pilots who had faced him that day left their own fragmentary records, the intercept reports and debriefings that survived the war's end in various archives. These documents revealed confusion about what had opposed them, references to Escort strength that did not match the actual American deployment, assessments of the defensive effort that assumed multiple aircraft where only one had flown. The intelligence officers who studied these records after the war found in them confirmation of what the American side already knew. Howard's defense had created effects disproportionate to his numbers, the perception of strength amplified by the persistence and aggression of his engagement. The German pilots had fought against what they believed was a coordinated defense because no other explanation fit their experience. One pilot, one Mustang, one decision to remain when doctrine, fuel, ammunition, and probability all counseled withdrawal. The cost of that decision could be measured in various ways. The physical toll on Howard's body, the strain of sustained combat, maneuvering at altitudes and G-loadings that pushed human endurance to its limits, the mechanical toll on his aircraft, the damage and wear that made its continued airworthiness uncertain, the psychological toll, never discussed publicly, of carrying the knowledge that survival had depended on factors beyond conscious control, and the toll on the men he protected, which was precisely nothing. The bomber crews returned to England. They flew again. They continued the campaign that would eventually break the Luftwaffe's capacity to defend German skies. This was what aerial courage cost, not glory, not legend, just the willingness to be present where presence mattered, to continue when continuation seemed impossible, to hold position between 130 bombers and the forces arrayed to destroy them. The sky over Oschersleben held no monument to what happened there. The air currents that carried the sounds of combat dispersed within hours, leaving no trace. The vapor trails that marked the engagement faded before the bombers completed their return. What remained was simpler and more durable. A mission completed, men who survived, and one pilot who never claimed that what he did was remarkable, because to him it was not remarkable at all. It was simply the job. He had done it because it needed doing and because no one else was there to do it. The Medal of Honor recognized what the moment demanded, but the moment itself asked only for presence, for persistence, and for the refusal to calculate when calculation would have counseled retreat. James Howard provided all three, and 130 bombers came home.